Welcome to Ski Cap, Hoodie, and Shorts, Episode 33, Code and Language. Hey everybody, welcome to the Ski Cap, Hoodie, and Shorts podcast. My name is Ted Samaras and I will be your host today. And today we are talking about code and language. And what I mean by that is, we're talking about computer code and how it compares to like written or read language, right, or spoken language. I know a lot of times that, people say that, computer code is just another language. Right. But I had a recent experience that I thought that I would dive into that a little more and see if that is actually true. So recently I've been finding myself writing a little more code. I tend to write like code-like things in Google Sheets. A lot of times I'm writing formulas more than actual code or app script. But I have found myself in Python a little more as well, just, in terms of looking at some code. And, I started to do a little bit of self-reflection. I guess that's what happens when you're sitting there sometimes and just writing out code or writing out stuff in Google Sheets. And I realized that although I've learned foreign languages in the past, taking them in high school, that type of thing, and although I do apps like Duolingo, and I try to practice things in Google Translate, or sometimes I will either download or grab a CD, if those still exist, right, at the library and try to listen to them in my car, that type of thing, all in ways of trying to pick up language. And recently, I've tried to pick up, languages like Spanish, right, as an example, because, that's something that I am exposed to a lot or need a lot. I have tried to brush up on my Mandarin, or try to make myself, I wouldn't say fluid, fluent, or fluidly fluent, but there are, working with some great educators in Taiwan, I want to at least be polite and be able to say a few words to them in native tongue, especially looking at a Taiwanese, dialect of Mandarin. I've also found myself dabbling in things like Ukrainian to try to be able to understand maybe some of the students who are here, who have come here because of, what's going on in their home country, et cetera, et cetera. So I find myself practicing with those languages, but I find myself sometimes struggling to retain those languages. I don't know if it's a matter of that I don't practice consistently enough, or I do practice consistently enough for a time, but then I find that I don't necessarily need that language for another given time, and so I'm always kind of relearning what I've just learned. And I compared and contrasted that to when I am writing things in computer code, when I am go ahead and trying to program something, when I am going ahead and trying to write out formulas in Google Sheets. And I find myself to be a lot more successful in retaining the computer code than I do the actual language itself. And I've always been of the philosophy, and I've always heard, computer code is just another language, right? And I'm like, yes, but, right, there's more to it than language, just like there's more to language than there is code, right? Code tends to be a little more, logic, math, data, science-based, at least conceptually in my mind, right? There seems to be a lot more structure in terms of things that happen, right? Expected inputs, expected outputs, right? And there's less of the variant that goes on in language. Even here, you speak English in one part of the country and you speak English in another part of the country, might as well be two different languages. So I figured at that point, I would stop doing the coding I was doing. And I, as a lot of us are prone to, found ourselves going down a rabbit hole in on the internet. So, I figured I'd share with you some of the stuff that I found. So what I found was interesting was I did find a lot of articles or a lot of YouTube videos and like, oh yeah, computer code, it's just another language, right? So don't be intimidated by it. And I get that. If you're somebody who's good at picking up languages, then that makes sense, right? You're trying to make that bridge or that gap between, regular language and computer code. But, I did what everybody else is doing these days and looked on ChatGPT for the answer to this, as well as obviously doing some of my other research. And what I did find was there were some other articles that talked about computer code as being more of a set of instructions, right? Kind of like a recipe or, that type of thing. And if this, then that, input this, output that. And so, there's more like expected outcomes in the flow when you're thinking about going through the computer code, even though you're thinking of, things like, like input, output, if, append, remove, right? Doing all that kind of stuff in Python, right? Where you put your parentheses, if X, then Y, all those type of things. Whereas language, right, tends to be not so much a guaranteed output at the end, but more of a fluid communication, right? It's more where like the word is symbolizing something. It's more where there can be expression, whereas code tends to be a little more boilerplate. Now, don't get me wrong. I really enjoy looking at data, and the more I look at it, the more I've become a fan of it over the years, especially for some of the great stuff it's done for me personally, both professionally and just in my personal life. But again, in looking at it, right, with the data, there's this expected outcome, and with the written language or with, spoken language, right, it tends to be more representative of ideas or representative of things. So I thought that in some of those articles, that was an interesting contrast. And there's a specific article that I actually want to cite that brings up another topic, and it talks about brain function, and it talks about some research that they did where reading computer code is not actually the same as reading language. And actually, that's the title of the article, right? To the brain, reading computer code is not the same as reading language. It was published by the MIT News Office on December 15th, 2020. That's the publication date. And the author of the article was Ann Trafton. And what it talks about is that, computer code actually does not activate the same parts of the brain that language does, which I thought was very interesting. And I don't want to tell you that, when, I'm trying to learn Spanish, this part of my brain flares up. And when I'm doing computer code, I can feel, that part of my brain flaring up. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I guess in the studies they've done, they look at where language kind of activates the brain. And they found that computer code, right, activates a spot called, right, a distributed network that is called the multiple demand network. And I guess it's more cognitive function where it is more math or puzzle type games, right? And they're saying it's not the same, though, as the language part of the brain that activates, but it's also not the same as the math part of the brain. So you would think, right, it would be one or the other, but they're saying it is actually kind of in a, different part of the brain function, which I thought was interesting and actually a little bit surprising, because I thought when I was reading through these articles, you're going to tell me computer code is language, that's the part of the brain, the language part, or computer code is math logic, it's going to be that part of the brain. But to find a different part of the brain that is actually processing computer code was a little bit interesting to me, because it's almost one of these hybrid type things. I guess in this part of the multiple demand network, right, it looks like it holds a lot of pieces at once. So I guess according to the article, and holding pieces at once is actually quoting the article there. But I guess like if you think about your computer, right, you know how sometimes your computer slows down when you've got too many tabs open? It's similar to that, right? That RAM where the computer can think about X amount of things at one time, and the more things it thinks about, the slower it gets because it's got so many things on its mind at once. Or when you're distracted by something, right? You're driving, but you're thinking about 100 things. Your eyes physically might be on the road, but your brain may not be on the road. So that part of brain function seems to be where the computer code is going. And so they even talked about, like in the research that they had done, that they found as though like that if you look 30, 40 years from now, and I'll quote here, right, professional programmers who have spent 30, 40 years coding in a particular language, you might start to see some specialization, right, of parts of the multiple demand system. So again, they're talking about that this specific part of the brain is actually going to see highlighted brain function as we start to test people that have computer coded for a long time. So again, this article, like I said, was fascinating. They actually corroborated with an article from Johns Hopkins that also talked about solving code problems. Was also in this multiple demand network. So it's interesting because it brings up a lot of things about how we learn. And, you know, I know a lot of times that computer code is in our STEM programs or our STEAM programs, right? And we treat it as though it's math logic based because of that input output, that type of thing. And then there's those people who argue that it's language. But realistically, if we look at the brain function that's highlighted here in this research, it's actually pretty fascinating to think about because it may be something that is either multidimensional, where you've got to kind of attack it from both angles, or it's something all on its own. And so maybe we need to really think about, how we teach code, how we have students practice code. And it made me kind of now, even as I'm recording this podcast, it's making me reflect about like, does that make sense? Is that why I have the sense of I could pick up code a little more and maybe, language, I kind of like, feel a little less confident in picking up. So again, it's fascinating. And again, because, the jury's still out on this, and, we have more and more people doing more and more code, it will be interesting to see this study in 30, 40, 50 years, to see if our brain function, actually changes, due to professions like this. So what do you think about this, right? Again, we're talking about, computer coding, and it's different than languages. Do you have the same sensation that I do? Or are you just like, this is just another language? Again, I'll be very curious to see what it's like in a handful of years. But again, I'd love to hear your feedback on it as well, because this show performs best with the more feedback we get. So if you'd like to reach out, I'd love to hear from you. You can go to our main website, which is www.skicaphoodieandshorts.com. You can email me at skicaphoodieandshorts@gmail.com. If you would like to reach out to me on social media, on Twitter specifically, you can always do that by going to my main Twitter, which is @OurTechCoach. And if you want to see some of the great work that I'm doing with educators, some great educators globally, and some different projects that I'm involved in, go to my main website, which is www.OurTechCoach.com. As always, I really want to thank you for joining, because again, this podcast is about you and all the great feedback again I get from you. So thank you for listening to Ski Cap, Hoodie, and Shorts. And please remember to be good to yourself and be yourself.